The evening had started like any other. Vivian was in the living room tidying up after dinner while the children played with their toys on the carpet. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, and she glanced at it, noting that Peter was late. He had called earlier to say that he would be working late at the construction site, so she wasn't too worried. She sighed, brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear, and turned her attention back to the children. "All right, kiddos, time for bed," she called, her voice gentle but firm. The children groaned in protest, but Vivian smiled and ushered them upstairs, guiding them through their bedtime routine. She read them a story, her voice soft and soothing, and watched as their eyelids grew heavy. Soon both were asleep, their faces peaceful in the dim light of the nightlight. Vivian made her way back downstairs, the house now quiet. She was just about to sit down with a cup of tea when the phone rang. The sudden noise startled her, and she rushed to pick it up, her heart skipping a beat. It was Peter's colleague, his voice shaky and strained. As he spoke, Vivian felt her world begin to unravel. There had been an accident at the construction site. Peter had been involved. He hadn't made it. The words echoed in her mind, each one a dagger to her heart. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Her vision blurred as tears filled her eyes and she sank to the floor, the phone slipping from her hand. Everything around her seemed to fade away, and all she could see were the moments she had shared with Peter, their first date, their wedding day, the birth of their children. Their entire life together flashed before her eyes, a cruel reminder of what she had just lost. The next day was a blur. Vivian moved through it in a daze, barely aware of the people around her. The construction company had reached out, offering to cover all the funeral expenses. They explained that the funeral would be held with a closed casket. Peter's body had been too badly damaged in the accident. Vivian nodded numbly, her heart heavy with grief. She couldn't bring herself to tell the children what had happened. Not yet. Instead, she sent them to stay with her friend, hoping to shield them from the pain for just a little while longer. The day of the funeral arrived, and Vivian felt as though she was watching herself from a distance. She stood by the graveside, her face pale and expressionless, as friends and family gathered around her. They spoke words of comfort, but she barely heard them. Inside, she felt an unbearable emptiness, a deep, aching loneliness that seemed to swallow her whole. The world moved on around her, but Vivian was stuck, lost in her grief, unable to find a way forward. She watched as the casket was lowered into the ground, her heart breaking all over again. Peter was gone, and with him, the life she had known and loved. Her best friend Anna stayed close by her side, guiding her through the motions. She helped with the children, made sure they were fed, and tried to get Vivian to eat, but Vivian could hardly find the will to move. At night, she would lie awake, staring at the empty side of the bed, her heart aching in a way that she had never known before. The life she had loved was gone, and she couldn't fathom how she would ever find her way forward. One afternoon, the family lawyer came to see her. His expression was serious, his words measured. He explained that Peter had left behind a mountain of debt that she had never known about. The house, their savings, everything would have to be handed over to the bank. Vivian felt as if the ground was shifting beneath her feet once again. Everything she had left of Peter, everything they had built, was slipping away from her grasp. She had no choice but to leave their home, the place where they had raised their children, and find somewhere else to live. Anna offered her a place to stay, and for a few weeks, Vivian tried to settle in. But the reminders of her old life were everywhere. The memories of her marriage haunted her, and she felt like she was drowning in her grief. Eventually, she made the difficult decision to move back to her parents' home, to the small town she had left behind years ago. She needed a fresh start, a place where she could try to heal and rebuild her life for her children. As she packed up her belongings, Vivian felt a heavy weight on her heart. Each item she placed in a box carried a memory, a moment of joy, a piece of her past that she was now leaving behind. She tried to stay strong for her children, but the tears would come in the quiet moments, when no one was watching. The drive to her parents' house was long and somber, the countryside blurring past her as she tried to focus on the road ahead. The children slept in the back seat, unaware of the change that awaited them. When they finally arrived, Vivian's parents were there to welcome her, their faces etched with worry and love. They hugged her tightly, and for the first time since Peter's death, Vivian allowed herself to truly cry. She cried for her loss, for the future she had imagined, and for the uncertainty that now lay ahead. In that moment, she realized that her old life was truly over, and that she would have to find a way to begin again, one day at a time. Moving in with her parents was both a comfort and a challenge for Vivian. The house she had grown up in was filled with memories, but it was also a reminder of the life she had left behind. She knew she had to be strong, not just for herself, but for her children. They needed her now more than ever, and she was determined to do whatever it took to provide for them. The first few weeks were the hardest. Vivian's emotional state was fragile, and she often found herself on the verge of tears. She would wake up each morning, her heart heavy with grief, and force herself to get out of bed. Her parents were a constant source of support, helping with the children and doing their best to distract her from her sorrow. They took the kids to the park, played games with them, and tried to create a sense of normalcy in the midst of the upheaval. Vivian knew she couldn't rely on her parents forever. She needed to find a job, something that would allow her to support her children and regain a sense of independence. It wasn't easy. Her qualifications seemed out of place in the small town, and there weren't many opportunities available. Eventually, she found work at a local store, a low-paying job that was a far cry from the life she had once known. But it was a start, and for now, that was enough. The days were long, and the work was tiring. Vivian spent her shifts on her feet, ringing up customers and stocking shelves, her mind often drifting to thoughts of Peter and the life they had shared. At night, after the children were asleep, she would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, the tears coming silently. She missed Peter terribly, the ache in her heart never fully subsiding. Sometimes she would bury her face in her pillow and let herself cry, her sobs muffled so as not to wake anyone. But amidst the pain, there were small moments of light. Her co-workers at the store were kind, offering her smiles and words of encouragement. They knew what she had been through, and their quiet support helped her more than they could ever know. Slowly, Vivian began to find her footing. She made a few friends, people who understood her situation and treated her with compassion. Her parents continued to help with the children, giving her the space she needed to adjust to her new life. Her children, too, were adjusting. They missed their father, and sometimes they would ask about him, their innocent questions breaking Vivian's heart. She wasn't ready to tell them the full truth. Not yet. Instead, she would hold them close, reassuring them that they were loved and that she would always be there for them. Despite everything, the children seemed to be doing well. They laughed, they played, and they brought joy into Vivian's life, even in her darkest moments. With time, Vivian began to see a glimmer of hope. She was far from healed, but she was beginning to move forward. The kindness of those around her, the warmth of her parents, the support of her co-workers, the love of her children, was slowly helping her to heal. She knew she still had a long road ahead, but for the first time since Peter's death, she began to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could find happiness again. One afternoon, while working at the store, Vivian heard someone call her name. The voice was familiar, and when she turned around, she saw him, Nick, her old boyfriend from years ago. Her heart skipped a beat, a mixture of surprise and awkwardness washing over her. Nick's face lit up when he saw her, his eyes filled with warmth. "Vivian," he said, stepping closer. "I can't believe it's you. What are you doing here?" Vivian felt a lump form in her throat. She hadn't expected to see anyone from her past, let alone Nick. Memories of their relationship rushed back to her, the laughter, the carefree days of their youth, and eventually, the bittersweet end when she had met Peter. She forced a smile, trying to hide her unease. "Hey, Nick," she said, her voice a little shaky. I moved back in with my parents. It's been a while." Nick's expression softened as he noticed her hesitation. He could tell there was more to the story, but he didn't push. Instead, he gave her a gentle smile. "I'm really glad to see you, Vivian. How about we catch up sometime? Maybe grab a coffee?" Vivian hesitated. She was happy to see Nick, but the memories of their past relationship made the moment feel strange. Still, she found herself nodding. "Sure, that sounds nice." That evening, they met at a small cafe in town. Vivian felt a wave of nervousness as she sat across from Nick, the past and present colliding in a way that made her feel as though she was betraying Peter's memory. Nick, sensing her discomfort, didn't press her for details. Instead, he spoke about his own life, how he'd stayed in town, how things had changed over the years. Eventually, Vivian found herself opening up. She told Nick about Peter, about his death, and how she was now trying to make a life for herself and her children. Her voice wavered as she spoke, but Nick listened intently, his eyes full of empathy. He reached across the table, giving her hand a gentle squeeze. "I'm so sorry, Vivian," he said softly. "I can't imagine how hard it must be. But you're strong. You always have been." Vivian felt her eyes well up with tears, but she managed to smile. There was something comforting about being with Nick, something that made her feel a little less alone. She noticed the subtle changes in his appearance, faint lines around his eyes, a maturity that hadn't been there before. But his kindness, his warmth, was just as she remembered. For a moment, she allowed herself to remember the happy times they had shared, the lightness of their youth. By the end of the evening, Vivian felt a small sense of relief. It was strange, reconnecting with someone from her past, but it was also nice to remember that there had been good times before, and maybe there could be good times again. As they parted ways, Nick gave her a reassuring smile. "Take care, Vivian," he said, "and if you ever need anything, I'm here." She nodded, watching as he walked away, a mix of emotions swirling inside her. It felt like a step forward, however small. Maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance for happiness in her future. Life for Vivian had settled into a routine that revolved around her children, her job, and the occasional gatherings with friends. It wasn't easy, but she was finding her way, day by day. One afternoon, she was outside with the kids playing catch in the yard. Their laughter echoed through the quiet street, and for a brief moment, Vivian felt a sense of normalcy return to her life. Suddenly, a car pulled up beside them, and Vivian looked up to see a familiar face. Nick stepped out, a warm smile on his face. Her heart skipped a beat, a mixture of surprise and a growing sense of comfort. She smiled back, her eyes meeting his. "Hey, Vivian," Nick said, approaching them. "I was just driving by and thought I saw you. I'm glad I was right." He then looked at the children, his smile widening. "Are you going to introduce me?" Vivian hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Kids, this is Nick. He's an old friend of mine." The children eyed him with curiosity, their little faces a mix of shyness and intrigue. Nick knelt down to their level, his voice gentle. "Do you guys like baseball? There's a game this weekend, and if you'd like, we could all go together." The children's eyes lit up and they looked at Vivian with excitement. "Can we, Mom?" "Can we go?" they asked, their voices filled with eagerness. Vivian glanced at Nick, then at her children, and finally nodded, a smile spreading across her face. "All right, we can go." That Sunday, Nick arrived at their house in the morning to pick them up. The kids were buzzing with excitement as they climbed into his car, their energy infectious. They drove to the stadium and Vivian found herself relaxing as they laughed and chatted on the way. The game was thrilling, the local team playing their hearts out, and they cheered loudly, the children waving their foam fingers in the air. Nick was patient with them, explaining the game and buying them snacks, his attention completely on making sure they had a great time. By the time the game ended, their team had won, and the children were overjoyed. On a whim, they decided to celebrate with ice cream at a nearby cafe. Vivian watched as Nick and the kids joked and laughed, their connection growing effortlessly. She couldn't help but smile, feeling a warmth she hadn't felt in a long time. Nick was wonderful with the kids, patient, funny, and genuinely caring. He seemed to enjoy every moment, and Vivian felt her heart soften, a glimmer of something she thought she'd lost forever. That evening, Nick dropped them off at home, the kids waving goodbye enthusiastically. Vivian watched as his car drove away, a sense of gratitude washing over her. Later that night, as she lay in bed, she found herself thinking about the day. For the first time in what felt like forever, she hadn't thought about her grief. Instead, she had felt joy, however fleeting. And as she drifted off to sleep, she realized she was smiling, thankful to Nick for giving her a day filled with light. A week after their day at the baseball game, Nick called Vivian and asked if they could meet. He pulled up to her house that afternoon, greeted by the excited shouts and hugs of her children, who had clearly grown fond of him. Vivian stood at the door, watching with a smile as Nick knelt down to speak with the kids, his face lighting up with joy. Once the children ran off to play, Nick turned to Vivian, his expression a little more serious. "I have a business proposal for you," he said, his voice warm but earnest. Vivian raised an eyebrow, curiosity piqued. "A business proposal?" Nick nodded. "Yeah, my secretary is leaving and I need someone to fill the position. I know you've been working at the store, but I thought, maybe you'd want to consider working for me instead." He paused, watching her reaction. "I run a woodworking shop, and I think you'd be a great fit. Plus, it might be a nice change for you." Vivian blinked in surprise, taken aback by the offer. She loved the people she worked with at the store, but it wasn't exactly her dream job. This opportunity felt like a lifeline, something that could help her move forward in a meaningful way. A smile spread across her face and she felt a rush of gratitude. "Nick, I don't know what to say." "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. She stepped forward and hugged him tightly, unable to contain her happiness. Nick hugged her back, and for a moment, they both felt something more, an undeniable pull between them, a warmth that went beyond friendship. They pulled away, a bit awkwardly, both aware of the moment they had just shared. Vivian laughed softly, trying to lighten the mood. "Well, since you're my boss now, I guess we should keep things professional, huh? No more hugs." Nick smiled, but there was something in his eyes, something that hinted at feelings deeper than just friendship. "We'll see about that," he said teasingly, and Vivian felt her heart skip a beat. Vivian started working at Nick's woodworking shop the following week. She quickly settled into her new role, her organizational skills making her an asset to the business. She found herself enjoying the work, the camaraderie with the other employees, and especially her interactions with Nick. He was a fair and supportive boss, and their friendship made working together feel easy and natural. Outside of work, Vivian and Nick began spending more time together. They would go for walks, have dinner together, or just sit and talk for hours after the kids had gone to bed. The more time they spent together, the more Vivian felt herself coming back to life. She laughed more, she smiled more, and she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. She felt loved, and she felt like she could love again. Their old feelings resurfaced, but this time, they were deeper, more mature. The carefree love of their youth had evolved into something richer, something that acknowledged the pain and loss they had both experienced. Vivian felt a sense of peace with Nick, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, she could build a future with him. And for the first time since Peter's death, she allowed herself to hope for happiness again. 6 months had passed, and Nick had become a constant presence in Vivian's life. He was always around, sharing meals with her and the children, helping out whenever he could. He had even built a warm relationship with her parents, who appreciated his kindness and genuine care for their daughter and grandchildren. Vivian, for her part, felt like she was floating on air, happy in a way she hadn't thought possible after Peter's death. Recently, Nick had confessed that he had never stopped loving her, that through all the years apart, he had always hoped they would find their way back to each other. Vivian had been deeply moved by his words, feeling the sincerity in every syllable. She too had found herself falling for him all over again. It felt natural, like they were picking up right where they had left off. Only now, they were older, wiser, and more appreciative of what they had. One day, Nick suggested they take a vacation, a chance to get away from everything for a while and spend time together as a family. Vivian eagerly agreed, and soon they were packing for a trip to the seaside. The children were ecstatic, buzzing with excitement at the prospect of sandcastles, waves, and endless days of sunshine. It was during this trip, on a quiet evening by the beach, that Nick knelt in the sand and asked Vivian to marry him. The setting sun cast a golden glow over them, and Vivian felt her heart swell with emotion. Tears filled her eyes as she looked at Nick, the man who had brought so much light back into her life. She hadn't dared dream of a second chance at happiness, but here it was, right in front of her. With a trembling voice, she said yes, and Nick slipped the ring onto her finger. The children cheered, and they hugged her tightly, their laughter mixing with the sound of the waves. But what should have been the happiest moment of her life was soon followed by a shocking discovery that turned her world upside down once again. One afternoon, while walking along the beach with her children, Vivian noticed a small restaurant tucked away near the shore. It looked charming, and on a whim she decided they should stop in for a bite to eat. The place was busy, but they managed to find a table. As they settled in and placed their order, Vivian's eyes wandered across the crowded room. Her gaze stopped abruptly, her heart skipping a beat. At a nearby table sat a man who looked strikingly familiar. It couldn't be. Her mind reeled, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. The man's eyes, his profile. It was Peter. Her heart pounded in her chest as disbelief washed over her. Vivian stood up, her legs shaky, and slowly approached the table. She stopped in front of the man, her eyes wide with shock. "Peter? Is it you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The man turned to look at her, his expression cold and unreadable. "You must be mistaken," he said, his voice flat. But before Vivian could respond, her children ran up to him, their eyes lighting up in recognition. "Daddy! Daddy!" they shouted, throwing their arms around him. Peter's expression shifted, and he hugged them back, his facade crumbling. Vivian felt her world shatter all over again. He was alive. But how? Why? Nick, who had been watching from a distance, quickly came up behind Vivian, placing his hands gently on her shoulders. She drew strength from his touch and managed to ask the question that was tearing her apart. "You lied to me about your death? Why, Peter? Why did you do this?" Peter's eyes flashed with anger. "You don't understand," he snapped. "I had to do it. I was drowning in debt. I was tired of everything, of the responsibilities, of being the perfect husband and father. I needed a way out." There was no remorse in his voice, only bitterness and frustration. Vivian could hardly believe what she was hearing. This was not the man she had loved, the man she had mourned. He was a stranger, and the love she had once felt for him turned to ash in that moment. Peter continued to rant, but Nick had heard enough. Without a word, he stepped forward and punched Peter square in the nose, sending him sprawling to the ground. The entire restaurant fell silent, all eyes on them. Vivian turned to Nick, her eyes filled with gratitude and pain. "Thank you," she whispered. "Let's get out of here." They left the restaurant, her children clinging to her sides, their eyes wide with confusion. Vivian held them close, her heart aching but resolute. She knew now, without a doubt, that her past was truly behind her. Peter was gone, not in death, but in the choices he had made, and she had a new future to look forward to. A future with Nick. Their wedding took place in the fall, a small, intimate ceremony surrounded by family and close friends. Vivian felt a sense of peace as she looked at Nick, the man who had stood by her through it all. As they exchanged vows, she knew that the road she had traveled, with all its pain and loss, had led her here, to real, enduring love. And as she looked ahead, she knew that her past was just that, the past. The future was waiting, bright and full of promise.